Today, I want to talk about a blood marker that you've all probably had multiple times on your yearly blood work with your general practitioner, but unless you have gout, it's probably never been mentioned to you. And that marker is called uric acid. And I want to talk about it today because in recent years, there's been a lot of research looking at it as more than just a gout marker. If you are a doctor viewing this video or listening to it, you probably remember one day in medical school where they talked about uric acid and they said, yes, this is elevated. When elevated, it suggests the patient has gout. And so, if you're a medical doctor, they told you prescribe allopurinol. If you are a natural practitioner of some sort, they told you probably give cherry juice extract and moved on from there. But again, in the last 5 years or so, there's been a lot of research moving uric acid from kind of an afterthought to a central player in metabolic dysfunction, specifically with diabetes, hypertension or high blood pressure, and cardiovascular disease. So I want to dig into that further today. And you'll see the subtitle here is your environment sending you into hibernation? And you'll understand what that teaser means more as we go here. So I first want to give a shout out to Dr. David Perlmutter. He is a medical doctor that's a neurologist and has written multiple books, Grain Brain and Brain Maker. And now he's got his newest book coming out tomorrow called Drop Acid, where he's talking about uric acid and talking about its importance in metabolic dysfunction. And so shout out to him and the groundbreaking work he's doing there. And a lot of today's material is going to come from a combination of his book and some papers, specifically this paper viewed here from 2016, published in the European Journal of Internal Medicine, entitled Uric Acid and Metabolic Syndrome, from an innocent bystander to a central player. And in the abstract there, you can see it says uric acid is incriminated in a number of chronic disease states, including hypertension, metabolic syndrome, diabetes, non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, and chronic kidney disease. What is metabolic syndrome? Metabolic syndrome is the combination of high blood pressure, cholesterol issues or hyperlipidemia, so high cholesterol, and blood sugar dysfunction, so insulin resistance or type 2 diabetes, somewhere on that spectrum. So the three of those combined make up metabolic syndrome, and it used to be called Syndrome X. So there's lots of names for everything, but uric acid is involved in all of these, and this study is diving in further into talking about how uric acid mechanistically plays a role in each one of these. But before we go there, we want to understand uric acid. Where does it come from? Uric acid is a metabolite produced by our body from purine metabolism. And purines are things in our diet that have high levels of DNA or RNA in them, so high levels of genetic material. For example, meats have high levels of purines because there's lots of cells in meat, and the cells of meat have lots of DNA and RNA. So think of eating the cow or the pork chop or what have you. So if you're familiar with gout, the treatment for gout is to cut out. A lot of times they tell you, well, you're eating too much meat or you're drinking too much alcohol. Okay, because uric acid is increased by alcohol, by purines, sources of purines, which is a lot of seafood, actually, mollusks and sardines and things like that. And then fructose is actually the #1 source in America of high uric acid. And from 1970 to 1990 in the United States, fructose consumption increased by 1,000%. And you may ask, what is fructose? Fructose is a sugar. Glucose is the sugar our body most efficiently uses. Fructose is a sugar additive in many of our processed canned and bottled foods and drinks. Okay, so if you look at fructose, you might be familiar. You're probably most familiar with that from high fructose corn syrup, right? High fructose corn syrup. But in recent years, high fructose corn syrups kind of come under fire because people are onto its contribution to obesity and blood sugar issues, et cetera. So now they've renamed sweeteners, but fundamentally it's some sort of fructose derivative in those foods that are overconsumed in America. And studies show that with the increase of fructose consumption in the US, the increase in uric acid levels has occurred in lockstep. And so has obesity and the pandemic of insulin resistance and diabetes. More so than the meat consumption, or more so than the fat consumption. So you hear nutritionally, everyone point the finger at don't eat too much fat or don't eat too much meat, but they commercially very rarely ever say don't eat too much sugar, right? Because all the money is in the sugary drinks and the sugary foods and the salted foods as well. And salt plays a role in uric acid. So when you're listening to this and you're wondering, is this me? Part of it is, one of the questions you want to ask is, how much fructose am I consuming? And how much alcohol am I consuming? Because other than fructose, alcohol is going to be the next greatest source of uric acid production in the US. And specifically, beer is the worst. Beer is a double whammy for uric acid production because beer contains alcohol, which alcohol alone is a driver. But then beer also is produced by using brewer's yeast, and brewer's yeast contains a lot of that genetic material. So you've got the two drivers of uric acid production in one product, which happens to be beer, which happens to be way overconsumed in the United States as a whole. So you've got fructose consumption in the form of sugary drinks and sugary processed foods, and then you've got beer consumption. And second to beer, hard liquor is the next alcohol source that is uric acid stimulant. And then wine is a distant third, and depending on if you're male or female, has a different effect. In terms of males, wine tends to have a neutral effect on uric acid. In females, it appears to have a slightly uric acid lowering effect. But don't take that as a justification to drink wine, ladies. There are much better ways to lower your uric acid than to drink wine. So let's look at some pictures on how uric acid impacts metabolic health. So if we go to the next slide here. All right, so you can see at the top, we have uric acid, and then we've got three pathways. And at the end of those pathways, from left to right, we have high blood pressure or hypertension, we have diabetes, and we have obesity. And so uric acid is going to impact both the blood pressure and the diabetes by impacting cardiovascular function, specifically vascular function and the endothelium. So if we go down the blood pressure pathway first, high uric acid is going to decrease endothelial function. But before we go down this pathway, I want to give you a little bit more information. In the 1920s, the average uric acid in the United States was a 3. Okay. Today, the average uric acid is a 6.0 milligrams per deciliter on blood work. All right. The optimal range is less than 5.5. So you want about 3.5 to 5.5. So if the average US uric acid is a 6, then the average American is being driven down these pathways. And, you know, with about 66% of Americans overweight, that seems to fit, right? So we don't want our uric acid too high because we go down the metabolic syndrome pathways. We also don't want it too low because that can signify a molybdenum deficiency. And molybdenum is a trace mineral we need for health. And one specific pathway we need it for is an enzyme called aldehyde dehydrogenase, which helps us degrade histamine and detoxify environmental chemicals like volatile organic compounds given off by new carpets and new hardwood floors and things like that. So again, like most things in health, we don't want too little or too much. We want the Goldilocks version. We want the optimal, the middle range, okay? So uric acid drives high blood pressure by decreasing endothelial cell function. The endothelium is a part of your blood vessels that's playing the role in whether you should contract or dilate your blood vessels. So if your endothelium functions worse, then you have increased vascular smooth muscle growth, you have increased inflammation, you have increased oxidative stress, and all of these changes are going to lead to higher blood pressure. And high blood pressure is a precursor for cardiovascular risk, heart disease, and stroke. So we don't want that. Uric acid will contribute to diabetes by decreasing nitric oxide release. Well, nitric oxide is one of the components that contributes to whether your vessels are dilating or constricting, okay? Nitric oxide, specifically endothelial nitric oxide, is going to drive vasodilation, okay? So look at this double whammy. Uric acid decreases endothelial function and decreases endothelial nitric oxide, leading to constriction. If you have more constricted vessels, or say tighter vessels, you're going to have a higher blood pressure because the heart's going to have to pump harder to try and push blood through narrower vessels. So also with decreased nitric oxide, we have increased liver production of glucose called gluconeogenesis. You have decreased adiponectin, so that decreases your blood sugar handling, increasing oxidative stress, and decreasing insulin secretion, which leads to diabetes. And so the decreased insulin secretion is going to promote type 1 diabetes. Uric acid has been shown in studies to damage the beta cells of the pancreas, which are the insulin producing cells of the pancreas. And then all the way to the right, you see that uric acid decreases fatty acid oxidation, increases fat synthesis. So you're taking that fat seesaw from fat breakdown and fat making, and you're biasing it towards fat making, which leads to fat accumulation and obesity. And obesity is an inflammatory issue. The more visceral fat you have around your waist, the more that fat acts as an endocrine organ and is pro-inflammatory and produces things like TNF alpha and interleukin 6 and interleukin 1 beta, pro-inflammatory cytokines that we've talked about a lot lately. So let's look at the fructose piece of uric acid synthesis. So I said earlier on the first slide, I said, is uric acid driving you towards hibernation? And so where does that come in? Well, if we think about your metabolic rate, right, you can be lean and fit is one kind of avatar that we all strive for. And then the other avatar is not lean and not fit, right? Overweight to obese. Okay, so you could think of one as like the hunter-gatherer, and you could think of the other one as the overweight or obese person as the big grizzly bear who's going into hibernation. And what uric acid does is it sends signals to the body of hibernation, that you're going into hibernation. And when a bear's going into hibernation, right, they stop foraging, they're not looking for food, they're storing fat so they can get through the coming winter. So if your uric acid is high, it's basically a winter signal to your body to stimulate fat production and fat storage in case there's a lack of food. Now, evolutionarily, this was helpful because if our ancestors were going to go through a time of lack, a time of famine, a time of low food source, then storing fat would be beneficial because that would help them to survive. But in our society, this is an example of where our genetics and our epigenetics don't match up, right? We have the genetics of hunter-gatherers, but we live in an environment of abundance, an environment of too much fructose, right? So the more fructose available to us, the more uric acid it's going to drive, and the more fat accumulation that's going to occur, and the more obesity we're going to see. And that's what we see, as well as the blood pressure, the insulin resistance, the metabolic syndrome. And then you can see if you have diabetes, hypertension, and obesity, all of those things contribute to damage the kidneys because of what it's doing to the vasculature. So fructose, you want to keep fructose to a minimum at your diet. You want to avoid the hibernation signals if you're not actually looking to hibernate. And so, you want to do things like eat low fructose diet, eat natural foods, eat raw organic foods, and you want to exercise, because exercise stimulates what's called the AMPK pathway, which drives a lean metabolism. Okay, uric acid drives the AMPD pathway, which drives the hibernation. So we want to do the opposite of hibernate. We want to exercise. We want to be out there foraging, hunting and gathering, like our hunter-gatherer ancestors did, an ancestral type diet, the meats, fruits, nuts, seeds, vegetables. And then this image ties it all together. So the higher your uric acid, the increase your risk of everything we've talked about today, the insulin resistance and diabetes, obesity, blood pressure issues, kidney disease, which leads to cardiovascular risk, which then feeds back to increased uric acid. And then on the right, you see, the endothelial dysfunction, oxidative stress, and inflammation are the mechanisms by which these things occur. So if you've been having health issues say you're insulin resistant and your blood sugar looks good, and you've done work on your insulin numbers, but you're still not getting where you want to go, or you're having blood pressure issues, even though you would say you're not stressed and your salt is controlled in your diet, well, look to your uric acid levels. Perhaps they're elevated, but because they're in the normal range, your general practitioner hasn't done anything, because they're not going to do anything until it's lab high. Well, some labs currently have normal ranges above 7, some above 8. Okay. Well, anything above 5.5 is undesirable. And if normal range cuts off at 7, you're a longer way towards dysfunction than you would be if you were looking at this from a functional mindset. So go back and look at your yearly labs and find your uric acid number and see if that matters in your case and in your picture.
These three things, insulin, high blood pressure, and the third thing you mentioned,
obesity or
obesity.
cholesterol.
It's just super common. I mean, if I pick up based on my observation, a lot of people will have it.
Yeah. And that uniting factors for most people consuming a typical American diet or a Western diet is going to be that fructose consumption and the beer consumption. So those are, and then any other country. So India, India has a lot of obesity, right? From what I've gathered. And so
it's 10 obese. It's a funny way of saying it. A lot of 10 people.
Oh, they're skinny fat.
Skinny fat, yeah.
Yeah, it's called it's called sarcopenic obesity. So sarcopenia means low muscle. So relatively fat to muscle, even though they look skinny, they're fat from a ratio standpoint. Yep.
So the real approach to this, what I gather from you, is the food and exercise. I mean, that's where it boils down. It's basically the 101.
Those are the 101. And then two substances, natural substances that have been shown to reduce it very effectively, almost on par with the medications, are quercetin and luteolin. So those are two flavonoids that are effective.
Yeah, now I'm very curious to see my scores now. So,
Yeah. Yeah. So it's another piece of the puzzle, right? That it matters not just when you have gout, because let's face it, if you have gout, you waited too long to pay attention to it, right? But we're all making uric acid, and a lot of us will never have gout, but can still be impacted negatively. And there's far more diabetes and obesity and hypertension than there is gout, right? So this is just another way. We could now look at your A1C, your C-peptide, your insulin, your uric acid, and I've been doing this, but for you and people who aren't aware of it, this is on your yearly lab. So people who have never seen me, but maybe just seen their GP for their yearly physical, go look through. Hopefully they're running it on you yearly, as they should be, and you could go look through your yearly trends and say, okay, what's it been, and what does my health look like?
yeah, this
And then,
helps.
and how does that correlate with my diet and activity levels, my beer consumption and my fructose, my processed food and drink consumption?
Okay, so you went over key reasons why uric acid goes up.
Yep.
One was fructose syrup, and then second was the alcohol.
Yep.
How about other sweeteners? Do they also impact the same way or not the
If
same way?
if they're driving if they're fructose based,
Okay,
so fructose drives the uric acid, and then in alcohol drives uric acid, because alcohol is essentially um, metabolized as fructose. And then in beer, so there's that factor of the beer, but then also beer is fermented basically with brewer's yeast, right? And the brewer's yeast is a living organism with a lot of genetic material, so that stuff's in the beer as well. So that's a secondary driver, independent of fructose in beer, of uric acid. Does that make sense?
yep, I got it. Thanks.
Yeah, and I didn't talk about it in this presentation here, but recent studies are also showing uric acid tie-in with cognitive decline and dementia. And there was one study in Japan that looked at 1,600 people and followed them for 12 years, and they took their uric acid levels at the beginning of the study, and then every 2 years they had them fill out. They reassessed their mental cognitive status, and the people at the beginning of the study that had the highest uric acids had an 80% increased risk of dementia over the next 12 years, a 55% increased risk of Alzheimer's in that time, and then 166% increased risk of what's called vascular dementia or mixed dementia. And so in the brain, uric acid is, the oxidative stress and the inflammation and the vascular changes that's occurring in the rest of the body also occur in the brain and can, drive us further towards dementia. And interestingly, dementia is on the rise in the US and also has received a new name called type 3 diabetes, right? So if you connect these dots, it's very interesting and exciting to have another target, to monitor and address.